All right, we're going to talk about colonization. Caveat: colonization involves some horrible things that happen to people. Really awful things, categorized as atrocities. We're not going to go into those, and I prefer you leave those out of the comments. If you bring them up, I'll just delete it because I don't want to dwell on that. It also involves in exploitative labor relations. Rather than go off on a rant about anything, let's just agree at this point that the labor relations we're going to describe that Europeans imposed on Africans, and by extension also Asians, were inequitable, ex- definitely exploitative, and I would say unethical. You can say whatever you want, but I'm going to call them unethical, even immoral. But we'll agree on that. Having done so, like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to go over the history and economics first, and then when I'm done with that, we'll talk about the game Victoria 3. So if you don't play Victoria 3, stick around right now for the history because that's what you're here for. Now, this map of Africa in 1880. You see a bit of Algeria up there, that's French, and then a Senegal just down on this corner, and then right where my microphone is, it's covering up the Congo that the French have. And then just up here, above me, is the British port of Lagos, and then there, the Gold Coast that the British have, and then the French have the Windward and Ivory Coasts, and then there's a Liberia, and then down over here we've got an Angola. On the other side is a Mozambique, and at the very south is the Cape Colony. And that describes the European possessions pretty much in Africa in 1880. And that prior to this, if you go back 50 years to 1830, it's going to look a lot like this. Maybe less France and Algeria, not as much in Senegal, and the British don't have Lagos yet. Everything else, though, is the same. And that's because Africa was a really difficult place for Europeans to get into. Now, they traded a lot with it. And we will see a chart that shows the volume of that trade. And I'll put the point out that it was trade and the prospect of additional markets that really, really drove colonialism. There are other reasons that were put forward for colonialism, because in the 60s, when it was first being researched and thought about and discussed about, and the historians couldn't find economic evidence of any profitable activity in the colonies, and they came back saying, wow, they came in to Africa looking for wealth and they got nothing. In many cases, the colonies were a drain on the public purse. A waste of time, waste of money, waste of humanity. And it would be a waste. I mean, it was a terrible waste of humanity. But their conclusion wasn't worth it. Why did Europeans even bother going in there? Weren't they doing the math? Okay. So that was there. And so the other responses to that were, well, it must have been a matter of prestige. It must have been that they were really serious about ending slavery and bringing Christianity. And while they were there, they tried to make a buck and couldn't, and left Africa the way it was. Well, that went on for some time. But then I found a paper that was written recently, and let's bring it up here. I'll put a link to this paper below in the description. You can see how the change in light changes how I look here. But in it, it shows trade with Africa. This is a logarithmic chart. It covers from 1700 to about almost 1920. We'll say like right around the middle to end of World War I is covered here. And it's, like I said, it's a logarithmic chart. So the distance on the chart from 1 to 10 is the same as from 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, and so forth. So if you see a straight line on this chart that, well, it goes like that, it's actually a extrapolation which goes like that. So if it's straight on this chart, it's actually an exponential increase. Because we're saying that, yeah, if we had about 100,000 pounds worth of trade going on in 1700 in the slave trade, by around, this is 1808 here, that's 100,000 pounds, sorry, 1,000,000 pounds, or a thousand, whatever. So yeah, we go from 100,000 to 1,000,000, 10 times the value of trade. Then the value, this is the slave trade, the black dots, and then they drop off to a very low amount because the slave trade's being ended. If we take a look at other commodities, right around here, we have some data now that it wasn't available in the 60s. And it shows, yeah, it's around 10,000 pounds here in 1740. Gets up to about 100,000 in 1800. So it's at the level that the slave trade was before. Slave trade is still way, way far and ahead. 100,000 or a million to 100,000. But as the slave trade declines, the other commodities increase until we hit that £1,000,000 mark, and then we get to the £10,000,000 mark right around 1900, and it goes up from there. And indeed, if we look at other tables, we will see that by volume, the trade between Europe and Africa is increasing all through this period to where it becomes something like 25% to 30% of all of France's global trade, and between 10 and 15% of Britain's global trade. It may not dominate any one category, but it is still a significant amount that if you removed would put a severe dent into their economies. So obviously the trade is increasing, and we see this trade increase at a rate that is much higher than it was before. The slope increases, and this coincides with the period of colonization. Prior to that, we were relying here to get these numbers. It's all run by the Africans, but with Europeans in the ports. But after the Europeans move inland, the amount and value increases dramatically. So why didn't the Europeans go in before 1880? I mean, they had financial panics and collapses prior to that. Why didn't they say, well, let's get our markets in Africa now, before the next panic? Several reasons. The first was getting reliable transportation on the interior. Now, Europe has lots of canals and railroads, and you move things around on horseback or ox cart. It's got loads of stuff like that. Well, Africa before 1880 was not famous for railroads or canals or horseback or ox cart because there was some very severe things going on. Now, you've got this Sahara Desert here. I'm going to use the map above my head. This Sahara Desert where there's not a lot of anything, including diseases. So, plus one there. But then just south of the Sahara is an area called the Sahel. Now, the Sahel is an arid plain, great for horseback. And in fact, there were what were called the horse empires that stretched back and forth across the Sahel. But all the empires go in a band like this. They never go up into the Sahara, and they never go further south. The reason they don't go further south is because of the tsetse fly that starts in the forested band that comes just south of that arid band. When you get into the forested part of West Africa and down into Central Africa and even into South Africa, just around where the Kalahari is, just north of the Kalahari, you have the spread of the tsetse fly. And the tsetse fly would destroy any horse or cow or any kind of herd animal. They're just wiped out by the tsetse fly. If you took an army of horsemen and rode them all the way into Nigeria during this time period, your horsemen would just be men afterwards. The horses would be dead because of the tsetse fly. Now, there were parts of Eastern Africa out over here that were in highlands where it was not good for the tsetse fly, so they could actually have herds. That's why there are lots of herdsmen in Tanzania and Kenya. It's herding country there. But outside of that, once you get into the Congo Basin, oh no, we're not herding anything there. So that means if you're going to try to move your goods and services around in Africa, you're not going to use beasts of burden. Well, what about canals? Africa's not famous for its canals, and it is famous for its rivers that have lots of waterfalls and rocky spots and rapids in them, to where you could move a boat along a certain amount of length and then have to pick it up and move it over to another part of the river and then continue on, which made boat travel very ineffective if you're dealing with rowboats or sailboats. And again, it's not famous for railroads. There aren't any railroads really to speak of in Africa at this time. So the only way to get goods out would be you've got navigable rivers and use them while you can, but ultimately you're depending on humans to move goods around. And a human is no horse, is no ox. It's not going to carry as much weight of material per pound of food that it eats relative to an ox, camel, or horse. So it's difficult to move things around. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. But yeah, Europeans are not going to go into that mess because not only are the tsetse flies going to kill their horses, but the malaria is going to kill the men. And if it ain't the malaria, then there's a lot of other diseases in Africa that are just waiting to eat up the Europeans when they get there. Going to Africa was just reducing your lifespan by an incredible amount relative to remaining back in Europe. But there was an invention that came along, quinine. And that would help deal with the malaria. And by keeping you strong, by not having malaria, then you weren't going to be killed by all the other diseases that could kill you if you were weakened by malaria. That was the thing. Malaria weakened you. It didn't kill you. But once you were weakened by malaria, then all the other diseases got you. If you could stay strong, you could fight off the other diseases and be okay. And yeah, you can have netting and all that stuff, but the mosquitoes are going to get you. You need to take the quinine to keep from getting really sick and messed up. And quinine was around in the 1840s. The problem was getting enough of it because at the time they only had quinine in Brazil and the jungle of Peru. It was hard to get. And so the botanists at Kew Gardens in England were trying to figure out ways that they could grow quinine in other parts of the world so that way they could sustain not colonization of Africa, but their colonization in India because they're getting they're getting malaria there as well. They're dropping like flies because of the mosquitoes. And they actually do get enough quinine going, and it's still not quite enough to go into Africa, but by 1880, there is enough quinine being produced in the world in bulk quantities that now it would be feasible to fit out an expedition, give them all their quinine, and head out into Africa to stake out a claim and formally occupy an area. Now, there are some who said that the British were drawn in because they got involved in tribal politics and they just kept expanding further and further based on that. And there's something to it. But they didn't get involved in the tribal politics because they were happy and nice and willing to help out a lucky tribe or two. They got involved because there was trade involved, money involved. That's the driving factor there. Okay, well then, we got the quinine, we got that settled out, but what about the transportation? Are we carrying everything by porters? This is where the iron boats come in. An iron boat with a steam engine, you could bring it in past the coastal rapids and assemble it on the interior. The iron is actually lighter than the wood. And you're going, what? I have iron, I have wood. Iron weighs more. Well, if it's the same volume. But it's not the same volume because you need like a big old huge 2-foot wide plank or whatever to do stuff in a boat. And you could do the same thing with a 2-inch wide strut for supporting things, or maybe not 2 foot, 2 inch, but still you would have you have better strength in the iron for holding things together than you would from the wood. And therefore an iron boat was lighter than a wooden boat of the same size. Put in that steam engine, and now you're not depending on rowers or wind or currents. You can go up or down the river. If there's rapids, you can power your way through it. I didn't say it was going to be easy, but you could do it in the iron boat with a steam engine. So you got the quinine, you got the boats. What else do you need? Well, what if the natives don't want you there? And they don't want you to the point where they show you the point of their spears. or their uh, matchlock muskets. Or some of them even had bolt action rifles. They're pointing them at you. What do? Well, you die until the Europeans had a force multiplier, because even with quinine and these metal boats, they, in order to get at the commercial opportunities in the interior, the Europeans could not send enough men and supply them to defeat the armies if they were going to fight one on one. They needed to have that force multiplier, and that was the Maxim gun. It's the descendant of the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun was first introduced in the U.S. Civil War. It was hand cranked, and yeah, it was pretty cool. It didn't catch on entirely, but when a guy who worked with the Gatling gun, whose last name was Maxim, said, "Hey, wait a minute, what if we get rid of the hand crank and we just make it automatic? We pull the trigger and then and we work on some things to keep it from jamming. Now, what do you think of that?" That was a hit. That meant if you go out on a field and you have your conventional army of European armed soldiers against a conventional army of the native soldiers have, even if they all have firearms, most of them are muskets with a limited range, and they've got to charge to get close to you. Before the machine guns and before the bolt-action rifles with exceptional range came out, the Europeans were armed the same way, and they would meet, and force of numbers would decide the day. Europeans wiped out. But if the Europeans could position themselves and use their superior firepower to just destroy members of the advancing army, there'd be very few of them who actually got there who could be in hand-to-hand combat, and you could deal with those. You'd have even numbers there. But those machine guns and bolt-action rifles that could put out a high rate of firepower, were what was necessary. So then you could have an army of, say, 200 Europeans with African auxiliaries working with them. And I mean, that's 200 total. You maybe got 20 European officers and 180 Askaris or Trilliers or whatever, African troops. But they're armed with European weapons. You've got 200 of them facing 8,000 opponents from a native army, just blasted away. I don't want to say the word decimate, because decimate means 1 in 10. The kill rate is much higher than 1 in 10. The casualty rate is much higher. Tens of thousands going up against hundreds and getting beaten. Now, yes, there were times where Africans, the natives did wipe out Europeans, either in a siege or with an act of surprise, or they just had so darn many of them, and the European ammunition was just faulty. Yeah, and there's some famous victories there. But for the most part, the Europeans would just send in another expedition, and this time give it something that took care of the problem that got the other one wiped out, and then be victorious. So in conventional fighting, it was that Maxim gun that gave the Europeans the force multiplier they needed to defeat conventional African forces. And with those three all in place by 1880, the quinine, the gun, it's called the gunboat, but iron boat, and the Maxim gun, all three of those available around 1880, that's when the Europeans began to act on their designs for the continent, to begin to penetrate the interior, set up trade posts and police posts, plan out railroad routes, because if a tsetse fly bites a railroad doesn't get sick. If it bites a diesel engine doesn't get sick, keeps chugging. Put the railroads in, and that will be the replacement for the horses and cattle that can't be there due to disease. 1880 is when they start acting on those plans. And France and England already had an advantage in that, number one, they had placement on the continent, and they're thinking, yes, we'll just take our coastal territory and expand it inward. And not just straight out, but, we can go like that, right? Taking a wider area. They're already planning that. The Portuguese could not expand much. They were really poor. They're looking around like, guys, we just have the coastal strip. That's it. How are you guys talking about going in? The Dutch had an enclave that was there in 1830 that's not there in 1880 because they sold it to the British. So did the Danish. And that's it. Those are the guys who have actual territory that are expanding into the continent. Well, Germany had just unified back in 1871, and they wanted to have a crack at the continent. They thought they deserved something. And Belgium had been very good at industrializing, and its king, Leopold, thought, I'd like to have a colony as well. That would be lovely. And Otto von Bismarck saw an opportunity to get Germany its colonies by calling together the civilized nations of Europe to Berlin and have a conference there where they will talk about the African question. They didn't invite anybody from Africa, but they had European nations. They even brought in the United States. All right, USA. And the course of the conference, they disappointed or turned down everybody except for France, Spain, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium. Spain got this little bit here, and they got to keep their islands. And they got to keep the islands up here. They got a little bit of Morocco at the top and a little bit more of Morocco down here. Go Spain. France, as you see, they got to have all this. Britain was given a big chunk of the Niger Delta because they had explored it and laid claim to it. A big chunk of the Ashanti Kingdom. And South Africa up to Lake Tanganyika and Egypt, Sudan, and down here to Uganda and Kenya. And they got a little chunk of Somaliland too. Portugal was told, get off your butt and start working on claiming Angola and Mozambique, or it's going to go to somebody else. And Germany said, well, we've explored some areas here of Cameroon and Togoland and Tanganyika. Because we've explored those areas, we should be able to get them. And they were small areas, so everybody thought, yeah, okay, sure. And then France later on got kind of mad because it turns out those areas were really profitable. It looks like Germany, they got the best part of Africa. We just got this big old dumb desert. They got Cameroon and Tanganyika, man. It's not fair. Well, I don't think the French actually talked like that, but maybe they did. And then the Portuguese also got this little bit here called the Cabinda Strip. And they got to keep their colony here in Guinea, and so did the British. But perhaps the most unusual award was to Belgium. They got the entire Congo River Basin. This is way bigger than Belgium was, that's for sure. And the question was, can the Belgians even handle that area? And actually, it wasn't even the Belgians. It was the private domain of Leopold I. I mean, it's colored Belgium in 1913, but from 1884 to 1908, it should be colored Leopold. He owned it. He like laid out the cash for it, bought the thing, and set up the company, and got him going. Yeah, and at the same time, this part here of what is nowadays Zimbabwe and Zambia was southern and northern Rhodesia, owned by Cecil Rhodes, owned by him. He was working with the British, but he owned that area. And so both those guys have their Cecil Rhodes and King Leopold had their own private enclaves in Africa. All right, well, what happens coming out of this? The Conference of Berlin divides the areas, and they're able to make their claims, and then the country, and they made their claims based on the fact that they had explored the area and had staked out actual claims to police the area and put trade posts there. In order to get the Congo Free State, Leopold had to hire guys like Stanley, the explorer, to go out and actually set up trade posts as far as he could up and down the Congo. And, various other guys did that. The British, although they were supposed to allow international navigation of the Niger River, the guy that they sent there to explore and set up posts, he just knocked everybody else out. And then when it came time to claim it, they said, oh, gee, only the British are here in Nigeria. I guess they'll get it. And the French are going, and so it went. They set up the trade and began to exploit the region. As I said, the Europeans were very successful at conventional war. Any force of natives that came against them in a conventional war, 9 times out of 10, actually 99 times out of 100, it was wiped out. But in unconventional war, a guerrilla war, the Europeans were easily matched and sometimes horribly defeated by guerrilla forces that were protesting the European control of their area. I mean, if you look at these boundaries, the Europeans just drew them to follow rivers or plains or straight lines or whatever, and almost every one of them crossed right through tribal groups. There, one tribe finds itself half British, half French, or in different parts of French colonial administration. And you, at the same time that you're dividing tribes, you're also drawing a line around tribes that have a history of conflict with each other. And you tell them, now you're in the same nation, start loving each other. And they go, no, we don't really want to do that. And we have these kinds of conflicts that have not been really addressed, and they continue to this day. But at the same time, the people running the colonies, I mentioned the unethical behavior before. They're doing it here. Because in order to make money, they realize labor costs are kind of high. If there was a way we could bring the costs down, why, that would be great. Of course, they're also having a problem getting people to show up in the first place to labor. Hey, do you want to come work on my cotton plantation? And most of them are going, no. We've got our own little farm back here. We're fine with that. We grow enough food to feed ourselves. We don't need to make you money. We don't need money. We have enough. Why work? Hey, you want to build my railroad? Again, no. Why? So the European governments started doing things called hut taxes. The French introduced this, and it became a practice across the continent. The idea of the hut tax was, do you live in a hut? And the African that owns it says, yes, I do live in a hut. Why? Well, we have to tax you. Why? It's the law. Whose law? Our law. We own the place now. Oh. Yes, and because you live in a hut, you have to give us money. Well, I have some cowrie shells. We use that for money. No. It has to be money from me. Well, I don't have money from you. Well, you can get money from me if you go work on a plantation or build a railroad or do some other form of labor. Then we'll give you some money. We get the money, and then what happens? Well, then we collect our tax. So I work for you, you give me something, and then you take it away from me. So I have nothing afterward. Oh, no, you got paid. This is not slave labor. Let's just squash that bug right now. This is not slave labor. We're paying you for it. Yes, then you take 100% of our pay back in taxes. So our net result is 0. But you're being paid. You're not a slave. Quite a few Africans called BS on that. And they started rebellions because it was slavery. If not de jure by law slavery, it was de facto by fact slavery. Africa is a big place. People would rise up in rebellion and just disappear into the forests. That's the first act of rebellion. They don't have to actually fight. They just have to get away and build a hut somewhere else and hope they don't get discovered building in illegal huts. And armies had to be created of other Africans to go and round people up and drag them to where they could be forced to work and then be paid and then collect the tax and then send them back to their huts so that way they can, grow their own food, because next year they're going to be dragged back here, forced to work, given some money, taken it away, and then make them. Yeah. And it got worse than that too. But much of the work that was done was African troops and low-level administrators with European officers and mid to high-level administrators running the show. And this kind of forced labor made the goods that they were making much cheaper. And Europeans benefited from those low labor prices, much the same as there are people who benefit from low labor costs in prison camps in China. capitalism is a rough thing, and I'm not going to go into that anymore. I'm just going to leave it there. You can, if you disagree, go do some reading before you put a comment that disagrees with me. Do some deep reading, because I come at you, bro. This was really horrible stuff that was going on. In fact, it was so horrible in the Belgian Congo, or well, Leopold's Free State of Congo, that when the news broke about it, the Belgian government had to take it over. Just as well, because Leopold was actually losing money trying to hire forces to force everybody to do the work. It was not a good thing. And same thing with Cecil Rhodes. He was going bankrupt trying to control his territory and had to turn it over to the British. But by the end, the forced labor didn't stay that way all the way through history, just most of it. A bunch of it. And there were definitely laws that had racial components to them and cultural components to them that were very negative. The end result was Europe got rich off of Africa, first by the slave trade and then by the exploitation under colonialism. Africa suffered under it. But we should not be too surprised, because the reasons for the colonialism were primarily economic. Create new markets and derive new natural resources out of there. Once rubber became in high demand, Africa was an excellent source of rubber, provided many of the people were cruel enough to force people to extract it from... But it was done. By 1913, we have this map here. The First World War happens. The German territories are given to either France or Britain. And then after World War II, we begin a process of decolonization as areas that were under British and French and Belgian and Portuguese and Spanish government decide there's a way forward, either through rebellion or through negotiation. They're able to attain independence. But because of the legacy of colonialism, because like the railroads were built to go from the interior to the coast, it's still easier for most African nations to trade with Europe than it is with their direct neighbors. The trade networks, the communications networks are all Europe bound, or most of them are Europe bound. Now, China's doing something in there now. We call it the new Scramble for Africa. And yeah, they may make things, but again, it's not for uniting Africa. It's for benefiting China, ultimately. So that's the history, the economic wedge of colonialism here. I'm now going to go into the game of Victoria 3. So if you're only here for the history and economics, like, comment, and subscribe right now. Go ahead and make a comment that says, yeah, I stayed for the history. You left when you talk about that game. But do like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're here for Victoria 3, please do like, comment, and subscribe, because what I'm about to say is going to be something you might just like to hear. We're going to talk about it. Like, comment, and subscribe, y'all. I would love to be able to show you how Victoria 3 simulates colonialism so accurately, but I can't. And I'll zoom in on this. I'm in observer mode, and I just let it run for a few months right here. Britain already has a colony in Kenya, and it's 1836. We saw on the map they weren't even there until after 1880. What are they doing here 50 years soon, or 44 years too soon? At the same time, there's colonial growth down here. There's colonial growth up here. The only reason we don't see it in the Congo and this part of Africa is because I have a mod that pushes quinine discovery into a level 3 technology. If without that, it would be a level 2. It would be discovered within a few years or months, and then that whole area that was riddled with severe malaria and other diseases would be under control of Europeans. There's nothing in here to simulate the tsetse fly. Malaria is just a thing that slows down your colonization, and you can get going at any time you want. It's a terrible thing. And having metal boats No, it's not even a thing in this. We could right now also take an army, load it up on boats, and invade one of these coastal enclaves here, and knock it over, conquer it. And we'll expand our empire faster this way than if we do just regular colonialization that just goes bit at a time. Conquer Oyo, Borgu, Sokoto Caliphate, the Emirate of Borgu, just knock them all over, pay the infamy costs, and just keep rolling. And you could bring in like 50, 60, 70,000 soldiers and do not and just, or well, maybe not 70,000, but certainly, I mean, battalions. If each battalion is worth, let's see, about 500 men, we'll say, we'll average it out. It could be more, it could be less, but each one is 500 men. Well, if I drop 40 battalions here, that's 20,000 men. In the Franco-Prussian War, the French were thinking, oh my gosh, we'd love to be able to invade Schleswig-Holstein, which the Prussians own. We have a force of 30,000 men that we could do it with, but we would need cooperation from the Danes in order to get it done because it's just such a tricky operation. 1871, in an area of great communications, and the French are worried that they can't move 30,000 troops from France to Denmark, or, well, Schleswig, which is now northern Prussia. And yet in this game, we could put everybody on a boat, sail them into the Bight of Benin, and start knocking over small African countries. Wow. No penalty for disease, no penalty for supply. This is ludicrous. What is needed? Number one, having quinine not be discovered until a level 3 technology is great. Having a prerequisite for quinine as a level 3 and quinine as a secondary level 3 makes it get discovered even later. That would be wonderful. But also require the Maxim gun, the machine gun, to be discovered to actually get in here. Victoria 2 did that right. They required that you have the machine gun discovered and a few other things. Then you could get the event that would allow you to settle in Africa. We need that in Victoria 3. If you don't have machine guns, you're not getting off the docks. I mean, no way. Number 2, there should be something here that, because of diseases, limits the size of forces. Even when we look in World War I, the sizes of forces in Africa between the Sahara and the Kalahari, the forces were very small compared to what was in Europe, or even compared to what was fielded in the Boer War in South Africa, which is a much more temperate climate. Something should be done to limit the size of European forces. Now, you can hire as many Africans as you want to work for you, I suppose, but most of them are going to be really brought up into the European war. That was the case in both World War I and II, especially with the French troops that were brought into the European theater. You know, they were, most of them were made to fight up there, very little fighting in Africa itself. But there's something that has to be done to control the size of armies. I should not be able to invade Oyo or Benin with 40 battalions. It should be more like I could try to invade them with 5 or even 10. That's pushing it. 10 tops. And then above that, it's no go. We need something better for handling that. Disease limits and later colonization. Now, the next one would be, we've got to have something in there that allows us to stake out areas, because as it is now, everybody can colonize everything else, and you get these weird snaky borders, and you're supposed to be able to trade states to clean them up. That doesn't always happen. Usually the AI is saying, well, we'll trade this really low value state for this really high value one that you own. You know, great. No, I want something that's one-to-one. I want a quid pro quo. I'd like to be able to draw these borders better. I'd like to be able to stake a claim and say, all of this is my country's, and I agree that all of that is yours. Something where, if we could not just push out colonies at the beginning of the game, but push out expeditions. I mean, we've got the journal entries that you click on it. You can explore the Nile, explore the Niger, explore the Congo. Well, have multiple expeditions for exploring parts, and then they reward you with being able to say, like, you know, this area here, this strategic region, not strategic, but this state, That's yours. That state, that's theirs. And and then you stake your claims to that. And then those claims pay off when some event happens that after we've discovered machine guns and quinine and iron boats, an event kicks off that could bring us to, and this is a totally new mechanic I'm suggesting, but we've seen it done in Hearts of Iron 4, a peace conference, except call it a conference for Africa. And in this, you are able to formalize your claims. Just click on parts of the map, carve it out. You could have one for Asia as well, or stake out where you want it in China, and however they want to do it, that'd be fine. But have something where you stake out a claim, you click on it, and then you got it, and nobody else does. You could trade them if you want. You can offer them. You could sell them, but that's yours. That's your claim, and that's where you get to settle. And you don't cross the border. You stay within that. Then we get nice borders there. Okay, so but the borders is hardly the problem. Yes, we like to have nice borders instead of border gore, but making sure that we don't start too soon, and that if we have a big army, it gets wiped out from disease. Those are important. And if we bring any cavalry at all into regions of the tsetse fly, gone. You only get infantry and artillery. That's it. No cavalry. Nope. You can have cavalry where there's no tsetse fly, but where there is one. But finally, we have these forces here, and we could have the European conventional forces be very powerful and wipe out other conventional forces from other kingdoms and entities. But there needs to be something that handles irregular warfare. And this would stretch into rebellions that would happen in Europe or Latin America, or any part of the world, really. The idea being this: we need something in between unmobilized troops and mobilized troops. Mobilized troops cost a lot of money to maintain. They're using a lot of ammunition. They're marching everywhere. They're in active combat. Demobilized troops, it's a pittance. Well, there needs to be something in the middle where a given force is acting in garrison duty. They are actively suppressing unrest. That needs to be a thing. That needs to be a cost. Because right now, as it is, if I start getting a rebellion, like let's say I'm England and I've taken over Egypt, I've paid off their debts, and now they owe me something, and I've made them a protectorate, and they're starting a rebellion there. I should not have to have just the inevitable line that says, boom, you now have a rebellion, and we fight, and then the place is devastated and we rebuild. I should be able to move troops in, and whether it's a protectorate, a dominion, or a puppet, or my own country, as long as I have an interest there, or if it's a member of my sphere, 1.7, I should be able to move troops there and quash it. Now, the people who are opposed to my having troops there, they're not going to like that, and they may try to be unquashed, and they may step up their unrest, they may step up the rebellion. But again, in these asymmetric wars, in these guerrilla wars, the Europeans were not invincible. And the troops that they employed, the native troops they employed, were not invincible. Horrible things happened to them. And they did horrible things to the people that they were oppressing. It was a horrible thing all around. There should be a cost associated. There should be a decline in the population. There should be money being spent for that partially mobilized force, that garrison duty force. There should be a chance that, like we have with our the current revolution, how it'll spin around and then you get an event that makes it go up or down. Well, if we have soldiers oppressing people, that should add the events that make it go up or down, because, it could backfire. I mean, look what happened in Ireland in 1916. The British tried to repress it, and it didn't stay repressed. It kept bubbling over until finally they said the cost is going to be too huge. We got to let him go. We have to let go. India, became free. The same kind of mechanism there. They kept unresting, and it was a lot of it was peaceful unrest, but it's unrest all the same. And the British were trying to repress it. Didn't work. They became free. We may not necessarily see that in Africa in the course of the game, but it could emerge. Well, we could definitely see it in other European areas where there's significant minorities like Poland, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, Croatian, Italian, and Austrian. The Ottoman, different nationalities, Kurds, Arabs, Bulgars, Armenians. That you could have areas where there's unrest and troops go in to suppress it, and that gives you a chance to prevent just the inevitable, excuse me, revolution from happening. No, I'm not going to edit that out. No, no, no. This is the new YouTube. We don't edit nothing now. Yeah, you just see me live and real. But yeah, you don't have this inevitable march of rebellion. It could go up and then come back down because your troops are suppressing, or it could go up and then you bring in more troops and maybe now it goes down, or maybe you have so many troops there that it's just unreal how much it costs. Consider the French had to put over 100,000 troops into Algeria in the 1840s to pacify the region. Huge cost. And in the game, if they don't rebel, then you don't have any cost at all. If they do rebel, you move troops in for a few months, knock them over, and then you move on. It's not that hard to do. And you're certainly not moving at 100,000 troops to deal with Algeria in this game. We need it where if you have a colonial unrest or you have unrest in your own country, troops have to be brought up. There has to be some kind of expenditure if you want to prevent that rebellion. And if you don't want to prevent the rebellion, there has to be a way to negotiate and create some kind of autonomous zone for it. If they want full independence, great, but they may be happy with just an autonomous region that they get to run themselves. Those are my things there. We cannot show accurate colonialization in Africa or any part of the world as it stands right now in Victoria 3. So, if you know a mod, if you know a dev, have them contact me and we'll talk about this. If you know that this is being worked on, let me know. I'd love to know. Come by my Discord server and hang out with me there and just, spill the tea. But be sure to like, comment, and subscribe because that really helps the channel a lot. It helps it grow out to meeting other people. I'm not going to grovel for anything else right now because you're awesome. You know how to like, you know how to comment, you know how to subscribe, and you don't mind if I keep rambling on over and over, on and on and on, because nothing ever is going to make me stop because, I'm in control of my whole video. I could talk all night long if I felt